Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to another week of environmental science. We're starting to wrap up, guys, kind of on our marine biology unit, just kind of giving you guys a bunch of brief information about a bunch of different things that happen in the ocean. Now, expect sometime this week, you guys are going to get that project, and that's what we're pretty much going to be working on for the rest of the time. But we'll get to that later. For today, we're going to start talking about coral reefs. Now, some of you think coral reefs are super pretty, and a lot of us, when we think of coral reefs, we think of images like this and like this, bunch of different colors, bunch of different fish. And you know what? You're actually correct for the most part. But today, we're going to talk about a couple different types of coral, talk about some coral reefs that are a little bit different than the ones that we originally expected, the ones that we originally have learned about, and then we'll wrap it up. So a couple things. Couple key characteristics of coral reefs. Coral reefs are massive biological communities in geological structures. So one piece of coral isn't just one living organism, it's made of a whole bunch of different living organisms. Now, with that being said, the main structure of our hard corals, which we're going to talk about later, is something called calcium carbonate. Now, these corals do have small sessile cnidarians. Mind my speech, guys. There's going to be a couple big words in here. What sessile means? It means that they do not move on their own. So these cnidarians, I think it's actually cnidarians, but whatever. They're not able to move on their own, so that when they attach as polyps, this is where they actually start reproducing and they start replicating themselves. And that's how we start getting a coral reef. Now, cnidarians, guys, are related to things like jellyfish. And it kind of just deals with how their structure is, which we'll get into a little bit later as well. Now, for the most part, corals at night, they eat zooplankton. They have a common nervous and digestive system, and the colony begins with one polyp that clones itself over and over and over and over again, and that's how we get these extravagant, big coral reefs. Okay. Now, this is not always the truth, so we're going to look at a couple different things. First, we're going to look at the relationship between this big word. It's like zooxanthellae. I looked it up. I even tried to pronounce it. Guys, I'm just going to not pronounce it. Okay? I'm just going to point it. So the relationship between this big zoo word and coral, and then we're also going to talk about a little bit of this red algae as well. So coral contains symbiotic zoo. Contains symbiotic zoo. Okay. If you guys remember, we talked about symbiotic relationships. We had things called mutualism or mutualistic, commensalism, and we also had parasitism. This one's actually going to be commensalism. Actually, take that back. Mutualism. My bad. Mutualism. Now, these are photosynthetic algae that live within the coral. That helps the coral deposit its calcium carbonate faster, and it provides food through photosynthesis. So this zoo actually attaches to these coral reefs or attaches to this coral and gives the coral food while the coral is giving it a place to live. So giving it that plus-plus relationship, making it mutualism. Now, this red algae does grow in rock. It's hard sheets on the surface of the reef. Risk what this is going for, guys, is we all know the ocean has waves and has a lot of structure, so it protects us from wave action and from trapped sediments. So as things bang up against the coral reefs, this red algae is supposed to be saving it from actually breaking down. And it's actually trapping sediments to allow for more growth and for more food just to be in the coral reef. Okay? So let's look at kind of where coral reefs are, because I think we all understand that coral reefs, for the most part, don't live where we are. Okay? Now, I want to point out that this map down here says coral reefs are only found in this middle piece of the world. This has actually been proven not to be 100% factual, because there has been some coral reefs that we're going to talk about later found off like San Diego and things like that. So there is other coral reefs compared to these ones in this map. But in general terms here, most of our coral reefs, guys, are found in main, shallow, warm areas near the equator, okay, which is kind of this little section right here. Now, that's not always true. Around continental shelves, around islands, and the top of seamounts. Now, as I said earlier, this is not always the truth here. We're going to talk about a species of coral reef that does not always grow in these certain areas. Now, there's a couple big threats to coral, and one of the major ones, just like most things, what's the threat, is global warming. So heat stress causing coral to die, and it's bleaching. So these big pictures like this used to be colorful, now it is turning white. Guys, I will be able to show you guys an image later where like you could see the Great Barrier Reef, for instance, and it's all beautiful and colorful, and then 10 years later, it's completely white. Now, once a coral reef becomes bleached, it is dead. So there's no more growth there. So this kind of causes some issues when it comes to our actual ecosystem of our ocean. The next thing, divers walking on coral. So if we walk on things and we step on them and we touch them, coral actually dies. They're not super sturdy when it comes to living. Structurally, they might be strong, sure, but they don't react very well to like human interaction. And there's also something called a crown of thorn starfish, which I kind of want to show you this quick, just because it's kind of a sweet little starfish. But it looks something like this. And from my understanding, it actually attaches to coral reefs and kind of walks around on the coral and kills the coral as it's going, because it eats, from my understanding, the zoo that is on it, which is that big word, but I just can't pronounce it. Now, back to notes. There's 3 types of coral reefs. One we're going to talk about for sure is a thing called a fringing reef, which where it's a narrow platform, a short distance from shore, and don't contain a substantial lagoon. So a lagoon would be like a deep area right here, which you guys are going to see in the next slide. This one's more of like what you would consider typically where you have your reef, and then you actually just have your slope. Okay, so it goes shallow to deep. Now, there is something that's a little bit more common, I think, in our heads that we've probably talked about, and it's something called a barrier reef. So most of us know what the Great Barrier Reef is, which is in Australia, which is just a huge barrier reef. So what it is, it's farther from shore, and it creates a lagoon. So we have shore right here. We have a section of the water where this isn't coral, and it's usually just like sand or rocks, anything like that. And then it goes up, and this is where we actually get our coral reef. Now, this is called a barrier because as waves come in, they hit this coral reef, and this is usually where the waves break over, causing the lagoon to be a little bit calmer. Now, this is always the case. No, you guys all know the ocean gets pretty crazy. There can still be a lot of waves in here. But this barrier does kind of stop those waves from penetrating, and that's where those waves will crash over. Hence why it's called a barrier reef. And the last one is called an atoll. So it's a reef that forms around a sunken seamount, usually far from land. It's circular shaped with a lagoon in the middle. So it's kind of almost like an underwater mountain that hasn't crested the top of the water, but it's just basically 2 inclines or an incline on both sides. It's like a cone shape, and then your coral reef is going to be on top and down the sides. So looking at all 3 of them together. Now with this, guys, we're going to talk about a couple different types of actual coral. The first one we're going to talk about is something called hard corals, and that's the coral that most of us are the most comfortable and the most confident with, the ones we've actually seen. So they have a calcium carbonate skeleton. They're typically known as stony corals because once they die, they become pretty much a stone. And these are the ones that have the mutualistic relationship with the zoo, which we already talked about earlier. The coral gives the zoo a home, while the zoo, I didn't even write that in there. I messed up. We'll put it in right now. The zooanthe does photosynthesis and creates food for the coral. Okay. Beautiful. Now, these are considered the builders of the reef. They are the hardest structure since they are made of calcium carbonate, and it's typically the ones that we think of. Some of these examples is the knobby brain or the brain coral, and another one, guys, is called something called staghorn coral. So it's a bunch of little horn shapes, both corals, both beautiful, but they're both stony corals or hard corals. Now, there's something also called soft corals. So they're soft and bendable bodies. They do not have calcium carbonate skeletons, but most of them are made of a structural protein similar to your fingernails and horns. So are they super soft? Not always. So if you look at like your fingernails, they do have some bend to them. So they're able to move. They kind of describe these guys as having almost like a woody structure where like wood's able to bend and bend and bend. Will it eventually break? Yes. But not all soft corals have that. Some of these soft corals are complete soft body and they're able to just bend and move wherever they want to. Now, Soft corals do prefer nutrient-dense water. They do not have those zoo algae on them to do photosynthesis for the most part. Some of them do, but most of them do not. So instead, since they are sessile and they do not able to, or they're not able to move, they're actually waiting for different like zooplankton or different dead organic material to just fall on top of them, and that's how they actually eat. Okay. Now, some of the examples of these are the pulsing xenia and the sunburst soft coral, which are both really beautiful. Okay, and they actually are probably the two most cool that we're going to talk about today, just based off of looks. Now, the last one for me was the hardest to figure out anything about or find any research on it, just for the fact that it's relatively new. So the next one's called deep sea corals. So these live in waters typically deeper than 50 meters, but they can be found several hundred meters deep. They do not require sunlight to grow, so there's no photosynthesis, and they're actually known as some of the oldest marine organisms on Earth. And since they don't have sunlight, there's no requirement for these zoo. Okay, there's no requirement for those zoo algae. Now, with deep sea corals, things get a little bit different. They get a little bit weird. So they're used to growing in really cold temperatures. They also grow with sunlight. So with that being said, they have different characteristics and they're a little bit different. These types of corals have a lot of research on them, but not enough or not a lot compared to soft and deep sea corals because this is relatively new. We did not have the capabilities to dive down and actually see these deep sea corals until relatively recent. Now they're starting to discover that these corals are actually deeper and deeper and they're still actually thriving, and a coral reef could typically grow up to like 40,000 years, some researchers say. But since it's relatively new, I'm not going to make up a whole bunch of things and be like, this is exactly what it's like. I could not find everything. But I could find one example for sure. So here's an example of a bamboo coral. It's super pretty. It's super cool. They're actually finding more of these deep sea corals, guys, off of some of the lands in America. So I was reading something where they actually found a deep sea coral off of San Francisco, which is pretty neat because they typically didn't think there was a coral reef anywhere even near there, but there is a deep sea one. Now, deep sea corals, soft corals, and hard corals are all being affected by global warming. So as the water's heating up, we are actually seeing effects in most of it. Now, when we think of coral reefs, guys, we typically think of hard corals, so don't get that kind of twisted. Most of the time, this is what we think of, I agree, but there is other examples. So soft corals and deep sea corals as well. Guys, if you have any questions about any of these notes today, please reach out, please ask. I know this is very broad and very basic when it comes to coral reefs. I'm no expert at all in this content, but I'm doing my best. I'm trying my best to give you at least something about coral reefs that actually piques your interest. This week, as we're moving throughout the week, what I want you to be doing, you guys are going to get a rubric soon, but I want you to actually start thinking of your final project topic. And I want to be able to approve your topic. So if you have a topic and you want to email it to me, I will then tell you if that's a good topic or if it's not a good topic or how the heck you're going to present it or anything like that. Other than that, guys, have a good day. I'll talk to you later.